Do you think influence is needed to have your opinion heard? Well, one way to get influence is to become a New York Times best-selling author. Another way to have your opinions known is to become a nationally syndicated columnist. Another way to have your opinion known is to be a guest on Access News. We are pleased to have New York Times best-selling author, nationally syndicated columnist, radio host, and America's #1 populist, Jim Hightower, in the studio for an exclusive interview and down-home chat about our Constitution, Republicans, Democrats, Tea Parties, and other fun-for-the-whole-family issues. You're watching Access News, hands-on news. Access News is pleased to welcome Jim Hightower, national radio commentator, writer, public speaker, and author of many books, including Swim Against the Current, Even a Dead Fish Can Go with the Flow. Jim is a regular visitor to local Austin coffee shops where he can often be seen in deep thought, pen and paper in hand, writing his opinions to be published in one of many venues across the USA. Welcome to Access News.
Thank you, Tamara. I'm excited to be here and honored to be a guest on the show. I'm very excited about your show.
Me too. Another well-known Texan, the late Molly Ivins, she once said about you that if Will Rogers and Mother Jones had a baby, that rambunctious child would be you, Jim Hightower. Mad as hell, with a sense of humor. Are you a fan of Molly?
Oh, yes. I followed her as editor of the Texas Observer, and we lived in the same neighborhood over in South Austin, and we were great pals. She's wonderful, wonderful voice for just regular people across the country.
So tell us, what makes you mad as hell?
That the powers that be feel entitled to run roughshod over the powers that ought to be. The ordinary workaday people of this country. I have a deep belief and great faith in the genius, really, of just ordinary folks, that if they get the information they need, that they'll do the right thing, and that they have the power at a grassroots level to move things. However, we're having too many of the Wall Street powers, the Washington elites, to decide that ordinary people don't count. So they listen mainly to corporate lobbyists and to the powerful people in our country. And that's doing great damage, not only economically, but politically and spiritually.
You call yourself America's #1 populist. What is a populist?
Well, it's a belief that the central issue in our society is that too few people have too much of the money and power, and they are using that money and power to get more for themselves at our expense. So it is a recognition that the central issue in our politics is money and power, and that has to be addressed in every aspect. Whether it's about the environment, it's about jobs, it's about business and economic growth, it's about war, it's about every issue. It really comes down to who's making the decisions and how does that affect the rest of us.
So you're saying to be a populist means more of people-centered or people-focused, right?
Yes.
So if you're the #1 populist, who's the #2?
Well, you know, I was called the #1 populist. I didn't define that for myself, but there are a number of people out there. I think of Michael Moore, for example. Molly Ivins certainly was. We've got people in the Congress. That many of us here in Texas might not know, but Donna Edwards, who's a member of Congress from the Washington, D.C. area, Maryland. We've got Barbara Lee out of San Francisco area, who's just terrific. Just a number of good people out there, and including in our state, people who do stand up for ordinary folks.
I know you have strong opinions about our current government and politicians and how to get involved. If you could set up your own political party, what would that look like, and what would be your platform?
Well, my party would be the old-time Democratic Party, the party of Franklin Roosevelt, the party of Lyndon Johnson, though I disagreed with him on the war. I spent my early youth trying to get Lyndon Johnson out of office because of the Vietnam War, not realizing he would be the most progressive president in my lifetime, so that's a bit disappointing. And my platform would be to go to the people, get out of Washington, get out of Wall Street, get out of the focus on those at the top and focus on the many out in the countryside and invest as we did when I was agriculture commissioner here in Texas. The common theory of economic development, economic growth, that's being practiced now by our state. Rick Perry is big on it. He's got a slush fund of millions of dollars that he uses to give to out-of-state corporations to come here on the assumption that they're going to create jobs. It ends up they create jobettes, jobs that don't pay a living wage. They don't have health care. They don't have pensions attached to them. Don't have much in the way of upward mobility built into them. But instead of pouring the money into what I call tinkle-down economics, instead, percolate-up economics, invest in the people themselves. And as agriculture commissioner, I brought some people in on the staff who did a terrific job of that. We invested in small farmers. We helped to create farmers markets so farmers can sell their product. We helped to link farmers directly to supermarkets, to link them to restaurants, to link them to directly to consumers in numbers of different ways, to link them to our school system. And then we help rural areas develop their own processing plants so that instead of them having to sell the commodity and getting a pittance of the money that the consumer spends, let them also get that extra money of being the processor of the product and the packager of it. And that's been a great success in Texas, and you can go to any of the wonderful farmers markets here in Austin on Saturdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays, Sundays, one right here in this neighborhood, that are just terrific. And you see that in action. You see not only the farmers there and the consumers having a wonderful experience, but you also see the food artisans, the people who bring the cheeses and the good Texas wine and local beer. I'm a big believer in lubricating our economy. And you see people having fun and getting together. And that's what an economy is. It's also what a society is.
It's that sense of community.
Yes, exactly. It helps put the unity in community to have direct contact.
Absolutely. Now, your party sounds great. Curious, how would you characterize today's two major political parties? How would you describe them?
Well, there are two wings of the corporate party. The Republican wing is absolutely wedded to the moneyed interest in our state, in our country, and enthusiastically so. You see them now in Washington, for example, trying to beat back Barack Obama's suggestion. He even dared to suggest that maybe oil companies don't need $4 billion in tax subsidies right now, since they're making extraordinary profits. And instead, we ought to put that money into the needs of having more and better schools, having more in the way of stronger infrastructure, our roads and our bridges and our water systems and et cetera, having more across the board for the society, for people, for the common good. Yet the Republicans rise up and say, no, 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 we want you to cut Medicare, we want you to cut Social Security, no increase in taxes for anybody. Well, that's who they are. The problem is that my party, the Democratic Party, has gotten too tied to the money interests themselves. You know, when you begin to take those corporate checks, written on the back of them is the corporate agenda. And so my party has quit, over the last 20 years or so, has quit being a strong voice and strong activist for ordinary working people, for small businesses, small farmers, the environment, consumers, just the regular people of our country. And as a result, it's not that people have turned right-wing. You know, Rick Perry got elected last year, re-elected as governor here. He made a big point of that now in running for president. He says, look, I got 58% of the vote. They love me in Texas. Well, in fact, what he doesn't tell you is we had the lowest voter turnout in America. We had only 33% of the people vote. So he's actually the choice of about 18% of the people of Texas. Now the sad thing is the Democrats couldn't get 19%. So they're not going to get 19% until they start talking again like real Democrats. And the good news is we have more and more people, state legislative candidates and folks like that, who are standing up and beginning to understand that.
Well, as you know, here on Access News, we talk a little bit about our America's founding document.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I want to take a moment to just watch a brief video about
Oh, sure.
our U.S. documents.
Great.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
We're back with America's #1 populist, Jim Hightower. So many young political hopefuls talk about taking back America. Taking back America sounds like you want to exchange it at the store, get a new America. Shouldn't we be moving forward?
Exactly. You know, Rick Perry's big on, and the Tea Party people say, we got to take back America. Well, Perry's taken it back to about the 4th century. I agree with you that we've got to move forward in this country, and the only way you're going to do that is not a handful of politicians with corporate elites moving America. Rather, you've got to get the people themselves to move. You know, when I first moved here to Austin in 1976, a long time ago, there was a moving company here in Austin. I think it was Skeeter and Booger's Moving Company or some name like that, you know. And they had an ad a slogan that I loved, and they actually had an ad in the Yellow Pages, and they said, if we can get it loose, we can move it. And that's the way you get it loose in this country is at the grassroots level, and then the people will move it.
So you were elected twice as the Agriculture Commissioner and then lost to Rick Perry in 1990,
Right.
who we would love to have here on Access News. But clearly, it's no secret that you're not a huge fan of Rick Perry. But what would you envision if you were to win the presidency? What would that look like?
It would be a disaster. It would look like Texas. You know, he's running around saying that he's created the Texas miracle. 1 million jobs, he says, that he's created in his 10 years as governor. But, you know, the issue is not jobs. Slaves had jobs. The issue is income, wages, middle-class possibilities. You could go to any restaurant or cafe or bar here in Austin and say to a waitress, did you know Rick Perry's created 1 million jobs? You know, and she'd say, yeah, I know, I've got 3 of them. You know, it's not jobs we need, it's middle-class possibilities, and that has been knocked down here by Rick Perry as governor. You know, during his term, for example, he has created more minimum wage jobs in Texas than all other states combined. We now are tied with Mississippi as having the most minimum wage jobs, the highest rate of minimum wage jobs in the country. Mississippi, though, is a poor state. We're not. We're a very, very rich state, so we have no excuse for this. Perry, to me, he's a guy who's puts the goober in gubernatorial, I can tell you that. And, you know, we need, you know, and I don't think he's got a record so ugly of service to corporations that give him money and of appointing people to public office who give him money. And then using slush funds to give to corporations. He then does favors for those moneyed interests. This is not what America's looking for. Now, most Americans don't know Perry yet, but they say that the higher the monkey climbs, the more you see of its ugly side, and I think that's going to happen to Rick Perry.
What about voter ID?
You know, this is a non-issue entirely. They have not been able to come up with a single case of voter fraud, of ID fraud in the state of Texas. The Republicans in the legislature talked about it, they do talk about it nationally, but they don't find this. This is not our major problem. The real problem in America voting is voter intimidation, people being discouraged from voting. And, you know, we're supposed to want people to participate in our democracy, yet we've got a system that makes it very, very difficult to participate. You know, I grew up in a time when you had to pay to vote. There was a poll tax, and it amounted to like probably about $25 today, and so that's real money for poor folks, you know. And so we don't have that anymore, but we do have you know, very, very stringent, restrictive voter registration terms. You ought to be able just to show up and vote. You know, if you get stopped by a policeman here in Austin, they can check the computer and they know all about you right there in the car. So we could do that at the voting booth. This is not an issue really, but the real issue is that we need to be enlisting people, engaging people in terms of the information that we put out in politics and in terms of the passion that we have for politics, to cause them to want to vote and then to welcome them as strongly as we can into the polls.
I'm also wondering, I know that you're probably, you were just blown away when Rick Perry decided to run for presidency. How did that change your life? Has it affected your work, your columns, your radio interviews?
Well, it has put me more in demand by national television, who wants to have somebody who knows something about Perry that's willing to come on and say it.
That's why you're here with us today,
Exactly,
too, I guess.
exactly. Yeah. So people are, you know, since he's put himself out there, and he puts out what I call little Perry tales about his record, we need to set that record straight.
I'm curious your opinion on, related to the U.S. Constitution. We talk about that a lot here on Access News. 55 people back in 1787 came together for the Constitutional Convention to discuss, debate, and compromise, and they had the end result of signing the Constitution. Now, what if we revisited the Constitution today, came together? What would that look like, and could we even get it done?
It would look a lot like Congress, which is not a pretty sight. It'll look a lot like the House of Representatives is right now in Washington. And that's the problem with suggestions that we should have a constitutional convention. No, we're not ready for it. I think the public could be ready for it, but it takes a lot of education. You've got to remember the Constitution itself was not written at that convention. We had the Continental Congress before, we had much debate, we had state constitutions written and charters written, and so there was a lot of give and take and a lot of exchange, the committees of correspondence, and then when the Constitution was proposed, the debates that went around that, it was quite extensive. But I would also add that in my talks to groups around the country, I point out that it was not those founders, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Franklin, etc., who gave us democracy. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, made the Declaration of Independence, made democracy possible. But you know, the first presidential election, only 4% of Americans were eligible to vote. You couldn't vote if you were a woman, You couldn't vote if you were African American, if you were Native American, if you did not own land, you couldn't vote. So only 4% were even eligible. So the democracy has come from ordinary folks, like watching this show today. It comes from the Sojourner Truths and Frederick Douglass, from the pamphleteers, Thomas Paine, the Shays Rebellion. It comes from the Populists, it comes from the labor movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, the deaf movement. It comes from progress that just ordinary people at a grassroots level build and make happen over the years. And these people are agitators, you know, and they try to make that a pejorative, don't they, in our society? You know, oh, you agitators. Well, agitation is what built our country. And in fact, when they say, well, you're just an agitator, you can say, well, yeah, that's the center post in the washing machine that gets the dirt out. We need more agitators.
Curious about your opinion on two other issues. What is the greater threat to America? Terrorism or ignorance?
Well, terrorism is ignorance, so we start with that.
Tell me more.
And so I think ignorance, well, I mean, it's ignorance kind of across the board. I mean, the ignorance that you think you're going to really make a big difference by suicide bombing or flying airplanes into buildings. That you're gonna win people's hearts and minds doing that, but it's also ignorance in societies that don't deal with the ignorance of their people. They don't have education. They keep girls out of school, for example, in terms of the Taliban and Afghanistan and other nations around the world. But you know, ignorance in our own right as well. The notion that I saw a story this morning in the New York Times about the police effort in New York City to spy essentially on Moroccans, Moroccan Americans who live in, this story is out of New York, so New York City, and the police have been routinely snooping on, making notes about just where people go, that they go to a bookstore, they go to a cafe, they go to a mosque, and keeping track of them. And they say that this is necessary in case there's a Moroccan terrorist who attacks us, then we'll know where to go. Well, that's not America. That is ignorance at a very high level right there, because the strength of our country is not in our authority, it is not in our police power, it is in our values, and chief among those values is freedom and the independence to think what you want to think and to be able to espouse that. You know, Benjamin Franklin said at the start of this little democratic experiment that the destiny of America is not power, it's light. And the light he meant is the light of those values of economic fairness, social justice, equal opportunity for all people. That's what America really stands for. Unfortunately, we've got too many 5-watt bulbs sitting in 100-watt sockets these days, so we're getting too much dimness.
Really appreciate that. And in closing, just in one sentence, what would you want our viewers to walk away with today?
That you are the powers, that you have the authority. Patti Smith has that great song, people have the power to dream, to rule, to wrestle the world from fools.
Thank you, Jim, for being with us today on Access News.
A joy.
You can learn more about Jim and his work on the website, jimhightower.com. You can also ask questions, share your comments and opinions on our website, accessnews.us. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. One beautiful thing about America is that we, the people, have power. The more we know, the better decisions that we can make. For Access News, I'm Tamara, and that's Austin.
Thank you, Jim. Wonderful. Just
really
wonderful.
A pleasure.
I love it. My
Nice
pleasure.
chatting.
Executive producers Devorah Ben-Moshe, Ken Hurley. With funding from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation through the Knight Community Information Challenge. Supported by the Austin Community Foundation, fostering philanthropy in Austin for 35 years. The Austin Community Foundation, for now and forever. Created and written by Deborah Ben-Moshe, Ken Hurley. Hosted by Tamara Suiter-Ocuto. Interpreter for Tamara Suiter-Ocuto, Jennifer Stoker. Crew: Producer Linda Latowski, Director Editor Orlando Lopez, 3D Animation Doug Gray, Technical Director Carla Saldana, Director of Photography Brian Blake, Assistant to the Producer Susan Harper, Original Music Aaron Jake, Camera Doug Gray, Tim O'Neill, Ross Wilsey, Production Sound Mixer Rod Simonson, Teleprompter Operator Brandon Taj Mora. Additional crew: photographers Eve Granick, Devorah Ben-Moshe, intern Brandon Taj Mora, additional interpreters Jacob Stacy, Tracy Hughley, Jessica Graves. Website developed by Electric Leaf, Jonathan Braden. Closed captioning provided by CPC, Closed Captioning and Subtitle Services. Signing the preamble and the First Amendment, Casey Ketchum, Tanner Ketchum. Coached by Mindy Moore. Special thanks to Susan Murnett, Lisa Williams, Mary Ben Ramsey, Monica Williams, Janice Kelklar, Paula Lang, Jeff Garvey. Claire Bugan, Bobby Guerrera, Russell Harvard, Cynthia Foss, Bill Stotesbury, Caitlin Mack, Yitzhak Ben-Moshe, Bobby Nord, Kenneth Gladish.
Hi, I'm Tamara, host of Access News. Join me as I talk with renowned scientists, community advocates, powerful business leaders, and politicians from both sides of the aisle. Jim Hightower, Texas' own unique voice, nationally syndicated columnist, the People's Watchdog. Join me each Sunday at 1 p.m. on KLRU Austin for Access News, hands-on news.